A plantation daughter's cruel words echo through the kitchen as storm clouds gather. When the gallery rail snaps like thunder, it's the carpenter she despised who drags her from the wreckage, taking the crushing beam across his own back. Now she stands over his torn flesh with trembling hands and a basin of water. But in the shadows, a small girl whispers Latin words from a doctor's bottle, words that could save his life. Rain pounds the windows. Lantern light flickers on hidden papers sealed in leather. Hoofbeats approach through the mud. A courthouse bell will soon decide who walks free and who gets sold downriver. When the crowd gathers on those stone steps and she kneels with that basin in her hands, will washing away the blood, wash away the lies that built her world? The kitchen at dawn smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. Steam rose from the great iron pot where Lila stirred the morning grits, her small hands steady on the long wooden spoon. At 8 years old, she moved through the plantation kitchen with the quiet grace of someone who had learned early to make herself useful without making noise. Little Henry Harrow babbled from his place on the worn pine table, his fat legs kicking at the air. When Lila set down the spoon and lifted him to her hip, he settled against her shoulder with the easy trust of a child who had known her gentle hands from his first days. That was when Miss Eleanor stepped through the doorway. "Slaves are dirty," she said, her voice sharp as the morning air. "Don't hold him like that." The kitchen went still. The creak of floorboards stopped. The scrape of spoons against bowls ceased. Even the pop and hiss of the hearth fire seemed to quiet. Eleanor snatched Henry from Lila's arms. The child fussed, reaching back toward the girl's warm embrace, but Eleanor held him tight against her starched white dress. "You heard me," she said to the room. "He's my brother." Lila lowered her eyes but did not step back. Her lips moved silently, as if she were writing the words on the air to remember them better. Behind her, the other kitchen hands found reasons to study their work, chopping onions that didn't need chopping, wiping tables that were already clean. "Yes," Lila whispered. Eleanor swept from the room with Henry wailing in her arms. The kitchen hands exchanged glances, but said nothing. They had learned long ago that words carried too far in this house, where the master's debts made everyone nervous and the overseer's moods shifted like weather. But Lila remembered everything. That evening, in the dim quarters behind the big house, she sat on a three-legged stool beside her brother Nathan's cot and repeated every word Eleanor had spoken, her voice a perfect echo of the young woman's sharp tones. "Slaves are dirty. Don't hold him like that," Lila said, and Nathan could hear the hurt underneath her careful mimicry. "You heard me. He's my brother." Nathan set down the piece of wood he'd been, smoothing with his knife. At 23, he was tall and broad-shouldered from years of carpentry work, but his hands were gentle when he reached out to touch his sister's cheek. "She don't know you like I do," he said. "Don't let her words settle in your heart." "But Nathan, what if—" "Hush now." He picked up his work again. A small wooden horse he was carving for Henry. The child loved horses, though he'd never be allowed to ride the plantation's fine stock. "Miss Eleanor, she's got her own troubles. Her daddy's books don't balance, and everybody knows it. Makes people say things they might not mean." Lila pulled her knees to her chest. In the next cabin, someone was humming a low tune, the old song about crossing Jordan that seemed to ease hearts when the day had been too long. She hummed along, her voice picking up the melody with the perfect pitch that had always marked her as different from other children. "Nathan? I can read some of those words in Master's Bible, the ones in the little writing along the edges." Nathan's knife went still. Reading was dangerous, for their kind had been beaten out of more than one slave on neighboring plantations. But Lila had always been drawn to marks on paper like a moth to flame, tracing letters in the dirt when no one was looking. "What kind of words?" he asked carefully. "Latin words, like in the hymns Preacher Reed teaches us. Some of them, I know what they mean." Before Nathan could respond, the cabin door creaked open. Pike, the overseer, filled the doorframe with his thick shoulders and cold eyes. He'd been drinking. They could smell it on him from 3 feet away. "Boy," he said to Nathan, "Master wants to see you in the morning. Got some work that needs doing on the gallery rail. Storm coming up from the coast, and that old wood won't hold if the wind gets serious." Nathan stood slowly. "Yes, sir, mister." "Pike, and you, girl." Pike's attention turned to Lila. "I heard you been poking around the big house again. Kitchen's where you belong, not wandering where you got no business." Yes, sir. Pike's eyes lingered on them both for a moment longer. Then he spat into the dirt and moved on to the next cabin, his boots heavy on the packed earth. When he was gone, Nathan sat back down and resumed his carving. But his hands were tighter now, and Lila could see the worry in the set of his shoulders. "That gallery rail," she said, "it's rotten through in 3 places. How would you know that? I watch. I listen. Miss Eleanor likes to sit out there with her sewing, and I hear the boards complain when she leans against them." Lila twisted a loose thread from her worn dress around her finger. "Nathan, if that rail breaks, it won't break. I'll fix it proper." But they both knew there wasn't time to rebuild the whole thing before the storm arrived. And storms on the coast came fast and hard, with winds that could turn old wood into kindling. The next morning brought low, grey clouds and air thick enough to taste. Nathan worked through the early hours with saw and hammer, doing what he could to shore up the gallery rail. The wood was worse than he'd thought, not just weathered, but soft with rot at the core. He braced what he could and replaced the worst boards, but there were still weak spots that made him uneasy. Eleanor appeared at midday with a small group of visitors, ladies from town, who had come to see the plantation's famed gardens before the weather turned ugly. She wore a pale blue dress that rustled when she moved, and her hair was pinned up under a bonnet that cast her face in delicate shadow. Pike stood nearby, making conversation with the ladies about the quality of the rice crop and the challenges of managing enslaved workers. When one of the women mentioned how clean and well-kept the grounds appeared, Eleanor seized her moment. "Everyone knows slaves are dirty," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gallery. "That's why we keep them out here, away from the house proper. My father insists on it." The ladies nodded with approval. One made a comment about the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Pike smirked and spat tobacco juice over the rail. Nathan heard every word from where he knelt beside a loose post. Lila was in the kitchen doorway, her small frame still as stone. Their eyes met across the yard, and he saw the same words from yesterday settled deeper into her memory. The visitors left before the first fat raindrops began to fall. Eleanor lingered on the gallery, her sewing basket beside her on the bench. She seemed determined to finish her embroidery before the storm forced her inside. Nathan gathered his tools and headed for the quarters. He'd done what he could. The rest was in God's hands. But God had other plans. The wind came first, a low moan that grew to a howl. The old live oaks bent like grass, and moss tore free to fly through the air like grey ghosts. Rain followed in sheets, driving hard against the windows and drumming on the tin roof of the kitchen. Nathan was helping secure the quarter's loose shutters when he heard the crack. The sound cut through the storm like a rifle shot. He turned toward the big house and saw Eleanor on the gallery, her sewing scattered by the wind. She was reaching for her basket when the railing gave way beneath her hands. She pitched forward into the dark. Nathan ran. His feet found purchase on rain-slick boards, and he lunged across the gallery as Eleanor disappeared over the edge. He caught her wrist as she fell, her weight jerking him forward. The broken rail snapped further, and a heavy beam came down across his back like the fist of an angry giant. Pain exploded through his shoulders and spine. Splinters drove deep into his flesh. But he held on to Eleanor's wrist until Pike and 2 other men could pull them both back onto solid ground. Eleanor was shaken but unharmed. Nathan was carried to the doctor's back room, blood seeping through his torn shirt. The doctor was upriver, attending a difficult birth, and wouldn't return for days. His shelves were lined with jars and bottles, each bearing a small paper label covered in spidery handwriting. Pike took one look at Nathan's wounds and shook his head. "Waste of medicine," he said. "Let him heal or not. Makes no difference to me." But it made a difference to Lila. She appeared in the doorway as Pike left, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The room smelled of camphor and something sharp that made her nose wrinkle. Nathan lay face down on the narrow table, his back a mess of blood and splinters. "Nathan?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm all right, little sister." But he wasn't all right. She could see that much. The cuts were deep, and some of the wood fragments were still buried in his flesh. Without proper cleaning, the wounds would fester. Without medicine, fever would take him. Lila moved closer to the shelves. The doctor's labels were covered in Latin words, the same kind she'd seen in the margins of the Master's Bible. She sounded them out silently, her lips moving as she worked through the letters. Febris, fever, purgare, to clean, aqua, fervens, hot water. One bottle's label was longer than the rest, written in careful script, ad purgandum vulnus profundum aqua fervens, mel, acetum, lintamina munda. She knew vulnus meant wound. Profundum was deep. The rest she puzzled out slowly, remembering similar words from hymns and prayers. For cleaning deep wounds, hot water, honey, vinegar, clean cloth. Nathan, she said, I know what some of these say. He tried to turn his head. Lila, you shouldn't. The doctor wrote instructions. For wounds like yours, she touched one of the bottles with a careful finger. This one's for cleaning, this one's for fever, and this. She lifted a small jar of honey. For healing. Footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her blue dress torn and muddy from the storm. She'd changed into something darker, a brown wool dress that wouldn't show stains. What are you doing here? Eleanor asked. Lila didn't answer. She couldn't explain about the Latin words without admitting she could read them, and reading slaves faced punishment worse than harsh words. Eleanor stepped into the room and saw Nathan's torn back. Her face went pale. He saved my life, she said, almost to herself. Yes, and the doctor isn't here. Noam. Eleanor moved closer to the shelves. These are medicines? Lila nodded. Can you? Eleanor hesitated. Do you know what any of them are for? The question hung in the air between them. Lila looked at Nathan's still form, then at the bottles with their mysterious labels. She thought of Eleanor's words from that morning, slaves are dirty, and how they'd echoed in the kitchen silence. Some, she whispered. Eleanor's hand hovered over the bottles. Show me. So Lila did. She pointed to the jar of honey and said it was for healing. She found vinegar and explained about cleaning wounds. She guided Eleanor to boil water in the small kettle that sat on the room's corner stove. How do you know this? Eleanor asked as she prepared the mixture. I listen, I remember, but the writing, I know some words. From church, it wasn't entirely a lie. Preacher Reed did use Latin in his sermons, though he always translated for his congregation. But Lila didn't mention the hours she'd spent studying the margins of the Master's Bible, or how her perfect memory let her connect words across different pages. Eleanor tested the water temperature with her finger. Steam rose from the basin, carrying the sharp scent of vinegar. She looked at Nathan's wounds, then at her own clean hands. I'll need to touch him, she said. Yes, to clean the cuts properly. Yes. Eleanor picked up a clean cloth. Her hands were shaking slightly. This morning, I said slaves are dirty. Lila said nothing, but his blood saved mine. Eleanor's voice was barely audible above the storm outside. I can't let him die because of my pride. She dipped the cloth in the hot mixture and began to clean Nathan's wounds. The work was delicate and slow. Eleanor had to pick splinters from Nathan's flesh with the doctor's tweezers, cleaning each cut as she went. Lila guided her through the process, explaining which bottles to use and when. The honey went on last, sealing the clean wounds under strips of soft cotton. Nathan drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the procedure. When he was awake, he never complained, though Eleanor could feel him tense when she worked on the deeper cuts. His skin was warm under her hands, not the fevered heat of infection, but the simple warmth of a living man. Thank you, he whispered when she finished. Eleanor sat back, her hands stained with blood and honey. Thank you for saving my life. Pike appeared in the doorway just as she was washing her hands. He took in the scene, the basin of bloody water, the neat bandages across Nathan's back, Eleanor's stained dress. Well now, he said. Didn't you say slaves are dirty, Miss Eleanor? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor's cheeks flushed red, but she didn't look away from Pike's mocking eyes. He may be dirty, she said, her voice trembling with something that might have been anger or shame, but his blood saved mine. I'll clean his wounds. Pike shrugged and left them alone. But Lila heard the certainty in Eleanor's voice and knew something had changed. The words from the kitchen that morning, slaves are dirty, had cracked like the rotten gallery rail. And in the space between what Eleanor had said and what she'd done, something new was growing. Outside, the storm raged on. But in the doctor's back room, by the light of a single oil lamp, 3 people had found themselves on different ground than where they'd started the day. Nathan slept fitfully through the night. Eleanor dozed in the chair beside his table, waking whenever he stirred to check his bandages. Lila curled up on a blanket in the corner, her dark eyes watching over them both. When morning came, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the cleaned windows, and birds called from the dripping trees. Nathan's fever had broken, and color was returning to his cheeks. Eleanor rose stiffly from her chair and looked at her reflection in the doctor's small mirror. Her hair had come loose during the night, and her brown dress was wrinkled beyond repair. She looked nothing like the refined young lady who had entertained visitors on the gallery just yesterday. She looked like someone who had spent the night saving a man's life. "Miss Eleanor?" Lila's voice was soft. "Yes, thank you." Eleanor met the child's eyes in the mirror. "Thank you for knowing what to do." They understood each other now in a way that had nothing to do with the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. They were simply two people who had worked together to preserve something precious. Nathan stirred on the table and tried to sit up. Eleanor rushed to help him, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Careful," she said. "The wounds are still fresh." He looked up at her with eyes the color of dark honey. "Miss Eleanor, don't talk," she said. "Just rest." But she didn't move away from the table. She stayed close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, close enough that the boundaries Pike and her father insisted on seemed as fragile as rotten wood. Outside, the plantation was already stirring back to life. There would be damage to assess from the storm, repairs to make, explanations to give. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the doctor's room, Eleanor Harrow sat beside Nathan and Lila, three unlikely companions bound together by blood and mercy, and the strange alchemy of crisis that could transform hearts faster than any storm could reshape the land. The words she had spoken in the kitchen, "Slaves are dirty," seemed to belong to someone else now. Someone she had been before. She felt Nathan's warm skin under her hands and saw the trust in Lila's dark eyes. Someone she was no longer sure she wanted to be. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the master's clock. Each morning, Eleanor came to the doctor's room with fresh bandages and warm water. Each evening, she checked Nathan's wounds and applied new honey to the healing cuts. And always Lila was there, her small hands useful and her memory perfect for the complicated routine of medicines and timing. Nathan grew stronger by degrees. The deep gashes across his shoulders scabbed over cleanly, and the angry red of fresh wounds faded to pink lines that would become scars. He could sit up without pain now, and move his arms without the tight pulling sensation that had marked the first few days. But with returning health came returning danger. Pike made no secret of his plans. Nathan was strong stock, he told anyone who would listen. Young, capable, well-muscled from years of carpentry work. The kind of man who would fetch top dollar at the Charleston market, especially now that Mr. Harrow's creditors were pressing for payment. "Soon as he can stand steady," Pike said one evening over his bottle of corn whiskey. "Soon as those cuts won't scare off buyers. Then we'll see what he's worth." Eleanor heard these conversations from the hallway outside her father's study, where Pike gave his daily reports on plantation business. She pressed herself against the wall and listened to her father's weary responses, his growing desperation as debt pressed down like the weight of a falling beam. "How much would he bring?" her father asked. 1,200, maybe 15, if the market's good. And that would cover the immediate debt. "Yes, sir. Give us breathing room through harvest." Eleanor closed her eyes and tried not to think of Nathan's gentle hands carving toys for Henry, or the way he hummed while he worked, or the quiet strength in his voice when he told Lila bedtime stories in their cramped cabin. She tried not to think of him standing on a Charleston auction block. One afternoon, while Nathan napped and the summer heat made the air shimmer like water, Eleanor found herself in her father's study, looking through the old family Bible. It was a massive thing, bound in cracked leather and heavy as a millstone. Her mother had been the one to read from it during family prayers, back when there had been time for such things. Now the Bible sat neglected on its stand, gathering dust like so much else in the slowly failing house. Eleanor opened it randomly and found herself looking at Ecclesiastes. Her mother had always loved the poetry of that book. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." The familiar words brought a stab of grief for the woman who had died when Henry was born. She was about to close the book when movement in the doorway caught her eye. Lila stood there with a tea tray, her face carefully neutral. "Excuse me, Miss Eleanor, your papa asked for his afternoon tea." Eleanor stepped aside as Lila set the tray on the desk. The child moved with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept drifting to the open Bible. Eleanor noticed how Lila's gaze lingered on the pages, as if she were reading the words printed there. "Lila? Yes? Come here a moment." The child approached cautiously. Eleanor pointed to a verse on the open page. "Can you read this?" Lila shook her head quickly. "No, I don't know how to read." But her eyes were already moving across the lines of text, and Eleanor saw recognition there. More than recognition, understanding. "What about this?" Eleanor pointed to a marginal note written in faded brown ink. The handwriting was different from the printed text, smaller and more cramped. "Do you know any of these words?" Lila leaned closer, her finger hovering just above the page. "Manumittere," she whispered. "Libertas, testamentum." "You do know Latin. Some words, from church songs." Lila's voice was barely audible. "Preacher read, he explains what the old words mean." Eleanor studied the marginal note more carefully. The ink was old brown rather than black, and the handwriting looked familiar. Her father's hand, but younger. Or perhaps, "This looks like Uncle Daniel's writing," she said, more to herself than to Lila. "Uncle Daniel? My father's brother. He died 5 years ago." Eleanor traced the faded words with her finger. "He was always scribbling in books. Drove my father mad." Lila was still staring at the margin. "Dinah," she read aloud. "Filia sua. What does that mean?" "Dinah and her daughter." Lila's voice was growing stronger. "Or maybe, Dinah, her daughter." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Dinah was Nathan's mother. They looked at each other across the open Bible, the weight of discovery settling between them like dust in sunlight. "What does the rest say?" Eleanor asked. Lila sounded out the words slowly, her perfect memory calling up meanings from half-remembered sermons and hymn explanations. "Cum debito soluto. Libertas concessa." With debt paid, freedom granted. "I think so." Eleanor's hands were shaking as she touched the page. "Lila, if this means what I think it means." But before she could finish the thought, Pike's heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. They sprang apart, guilty as children caught stealing apples. Lila grabbed the tea tray and fled toward the kitchen. Eleanor closed the Bible with hands that trembled. Pike filled the doorway, his eyes suspicious. "Everything all right in here, Miss Eleanor?" "Fine. I was just reading." His gaze moved to the Bible, then back to her face. "Mighty big book for afternoon reading. My mother used to read from it." Pike grunted and moved on. But Eleanor knew he'd noted her nervous manner, the way her voice had caught on the words. Pike noticed everything, stored it all away like a miser hoarding coins. That evening, she waited until the house was quiet before making her way to the quarters. The slave cabins were dark except for one, the small space Nathan and Lila shared at the end of the row. Candlelight flickered through the gaps in the board walls. Eleanor knocked softly on the doorframe. "May I come in?" Nathan was sitting on his narrow cot, whittling by candlelight. Lila sat beside him with a piece of mending. Both looked up in surprise at the sight of Eleanor in their doorway. "Miss Eleanor?" Nathan struggled to stand. "Is something wrong?" "Please, don't get up. You're back. It's healing fine, thanks to you." Eleanor stepped into the small cabin. It was barely 8 feet square, with rough plank walls and a dirt floor. 2 narrow cots, a small table, a wooden box for their few belongings. She had never been inside slave quarters before and was shocked by how little space 2 people could live in. "I need to ask you about your mother," she said. Nathan's hands went still on his carving. "Dinah, yes. Do you remember Uncle Daniel? My father's brother? I remember him. He died when I was maybe 18. Eleanor sat on the small stool beside the table. "Was there ever any talk about papers? Documents concerning your mother?" Nathan and Lila exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them. "Master Daniel," Nathan said carefully. "He was different from your papa. Kinder. He used to say that slavery was a sin that would have to be answered for. Did he ever speak to your mother about freedom?" "He talked to all of us about it. Said there would come a day when God would require an accounting." Nathan's voice was quiet. "But talk is easy. Papers are hard." Lila set down her mending. Nathan, tell her about the promise. Lila, tell her. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then, Master Daniel made a promise to Mama before she died. Said if she could work off a certain debt, help pay for some land your papa had bought, then she and her children would be freed. It was supposed to be written down somewhere, made legal. But it never happened. Mama died of fever 2 winters ago, and Master Daniel died before that. After they were both gone, it was just Papa's word against. Nathan's voice trailed off. Against Pikes, Eleanor finished. Yes, Eleanor, felt pieces clicking together like the gears of a clock. Lila, that marginal note in the Bible, what if it wasn't just random scribbling? What if it was Uncle Daniel recording the promise? Lila's eyes went wide. A legal paper? Maybe. If we could prove it, if we could show that the debt was paid. Nathan shook his head. Miss Eleanor, even if such a paper existed, who would believe it? The word of dead folks against living ones? The courthouse would have to examine it, if the handwriting could be verified, if the circumstances matched the records. And what then? Nathan's voice was gentle but firm. Say we proved such a thing existed. Say we convinced a judge. You think Pike's going to let me walk away? You think your papa can afford to lose $1,200? Eleanor had no answer for that. The plantation's debts were real, pressing. Without the money from Nathan's sale, her father might lose everything. Besides, Nathan continued, even if I was freed legal, what about Lila? What about all the others? Freedom for one person don't change the system, but it would change everything for you. Would it? Nathan looked at her with those dark honey eyes. Miss Eleanor, where would I go? What would I do? A free black man in South Carolina that's almost as dangerous as being a slave. Maybe more so. Eleanor felt the weight of all the things she'd never considered, the brutal mathematics of a society built on bondage. Freedom wasn't just a matter of papers and legal declarations. It was a web of relationships, economics, survival. But still. If the papers existed, she said, wouldn't you want to know? Wouldn't you want the choice? Nathan was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. Yes, he said, I would want the choice. The next few days brought change that had nothing to do with legal documents or manumission clauses. The weather turned, pulling moisture up from the Gulf until the air itself felt thick as soup. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark promises, and Pike grew restless. Market's good right now, he told Eleanor's father over their morning conference. Won't stay that way if we wait too long. Cotton's coming in from up country, and buyers will want field hands over craftsmen. How much longer does Nathan need to heal? Week, maybe 2. Scars don't matter as much as strength. Eleanor pressed herself closer to the keyhole. Through the crack, she could see her father hunched over his ledger books, adding and subtracting figures that never seemed to come out right. The Montgomery debt comes due next month, her father said. I know. If we can't pay it, we'll pay it. Nathan's sale will cover that and the Williamson note both. And then what? We're not making enough from the rice to cover operating costs. The slaves eat more than they produce, and I can't afford to buy better stock. Pike leaned back in his chair. Might be time to think about selling the whole place, Mr. Harrow. Take what you can get and move to town. Eleanor's father was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like that of a much older man. My father built this place, and his father before him. Times change. Yes, her father said. They do. That afternoon, as Eleanor tended Nathan's wounds, she found herself studying his face with new urgency. The scars across his back were healing well, but they would mark him for life. Evidence of the day he'd risked everything to save her. Nathan, she said as she applied fresh honey to the cuts, if you could go anywhere, do anything, if there were no constraints at all, what would you choose? He was quiet while she worked, his back warm under her gentle hands. When she finished and began rewrapping the bandages, he finally answered, I'd build things, he said. Houses, churches, barns, places where people could be safe and happy. I'd build them strong enough to last. And Lila? She'd go to school, learn to read and write proper, maybe become a teacher herself someday. His voice grew softer. She's got a mind like a steel trap, Miss Eleanor. Remembers everything she hears, understands things most grown folks miss. In a different world, she could do anything. She could do anything in this world, too, if she had the chance. Nathan turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Not just gratitude or simple affection, but something deeper. Something that had grown in the quiet hours of tending and healing, fed by small kindnesses and shared purpose. Something that made the gulf between their circumstances seem both impossibly wide and paper-thin. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "you know what would happen if anyone suspected—" "I know. Your reputation, your family's standing. I know. I won't be the cause of your ruin." Eleanor finished tying the bandages and sat back in her chair. "What if I told you it was too late for that? What if I said that cleaning your wounds had already changed me in ways I can't take back?" Nathan's eyes searched her face. "I'd say you should be careful about words like that. And I'd say some things are worth the risk." Before either of them could say more, Lila burst through the door. Her face was flushed with excitement and something that might have been fear. "Nathan, Miss Eleanor, I found it. I found the paper." She clutched a small leather portfolio against her chest, the kind merchants used to carry important documents. Eleanor had seen her father's study dozens of similar folders, filed away on dusty shelves. "Where did you get that?" "Preacher Reed sent me to the big house for Master's Bible he wants to read from it Sunday. While I was getting it, I remembered seeing Master Daniel's things in the corner cabinet. The one with the loose door that don't close right." Lila set the portfolio on the table with hands that shook slightly. Most of it was just old letters and such. But this. She opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of parchment, covered in the same brown ink Eleanor had seen in the Bible's margin. The paper was yellowed with age but still intact. Eleanor leaned forward to read the careful script. "Bill of manumission for Dinah, enslaved woman of the Harrow plantation, and her issue, contingent upon payment of land debt in the amount of $800, said payment to be credited against her labor over a period not to exceed 7 years from this date. Upon fulfillment of said terms, Dinah and her children shall be considered free persons under the laws of South Carolina." The document was signed in 2 places, Daniel Harrow in the same careful hand, and Dinah X with a witness signature below. At the bottom, in fresher ink, someone had written, "Debt paid in full, April 1851, D.H." Eleanor's breath caught. 1,851, that was 2 years ago. Nathan stared at the paper as if it might burst into flames. "Lila, where exactly did you find this?" "In the portfolio, tucked inside a copy of Uncle Daniel's will." Eleanor felt the room spinning slightly. "His will?" "Yes, I'm the one that left his books and papers to your papa." If the manumission document had been included with Daniel's will, then her father should have known about it. Should have. Honored its terms. Should have declared Nathan and Lila free 2 years ago, but he hadn't, which meant either he'd never seen the document or he'd chosen to ignore it. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows. Another storm was building, this one with the feel of something that might last for days. Nathan rose carefully from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, and wind was beginning to bend the trees. "If this document is real," he said, "if it's legal, then you've been free for 2 years. Eleanor finished. "Then I need to get to the courthouse and register it before—" He stopped, looking at the storm building outside. "Before Pike sells you," Eleanor said. "Before anyone else gets hurt because of what we know." Lila carefully folded the manumission document and tucked it inside her dress. "How far is it to town?" 8 miles by the main road," Eleanor said. "But with this storm coming, the road might wash out." Nathan turned from the window. "There's another way, through the back country, following the river. It's longer, but higher ground." "I know that way," Lila said. "From the hymn." Eleanor looked puzzled. "What hymn?" "The one about crossing Jordan," Nathan explained. "It's not just a song, it's directions, river crossings, landmarks, places to shelter. Our people have been singing those directions for 20 years. Eleanor felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. "That's how runaway slaves navigate. Sometimes," Nathan said carefully, "when they need to. And you're saying we could use those directions to reach town?" "If we had to." The storm was building faster now. Lightning flashed in the distance, and thunder followed closer behind. Eleanor looked at Nathan, then at Lila. then at the manumission document that could change everything. How long do we have before Pike moves to sell you? Not long, maybe days. And if we wait for the storm to pass? Might be too late. Eleanor closed her eyes and thought of all the reasons this was impossible. The danger of traveling through a storm, the legal complications of a white woman helping an enslaved man claim freedom, the risk to her own family's precarious situation. Then she thought of Nathan standing on an auction block in Charleston. "When do we leave?" she asked. Nathan stared at her. "Miss Eleanor, you can't. I have to. That document needs to be presented by someone who can vouch for its authenticity. Someone who knew Uncle Daniel and can speak to his character. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than letting Pike sell you?" Nathan had no answer for that. Outside, the storm was growing stronger by the minute. Wind howled around the corners of the house, and rain was beginning to fall in earnest. Soon, the roads would be impassable. But Lila was already moving, gathering supplies with the efficiency of someone who had learned to pack quickly. A small bag of cornbread, a stoppered bottle of water, the precious manumission document wrapped in oiled cloth. "We should go now," she said. "Before Papa comes looking for his Bible, before anyone notices we're gone." Eleanor looked around the doctor's room one last time. Tomorrow, if they succeeded, everything would be different. Nathan would be a free man. Lila would be free to learn and grow. And Eleanor herself would have to live with the consequences of choosing love over law, conscience over convenience. "Let's go," she said. They slipped out of the house through the kitchen door, three unlikely companions heading into the storm. Behind them, the plantation settled into its nightly routine, unaware that the careful balance of its world was about to shift forever. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began to fall in sheets. But somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the courthouse and the promise of justice, and they walked toward it with the steady determination of people who had found something worth risking everything to protect. The storm hit them like a living thing made of wind and water. Rain drove sideways through the trees, turning the path into a river of mud. Eleanor's dress was soaked through before they'd gone 100 yards, the heavy wool clinging to her legs and making each step a struggle. Nathan led the way, his carpenter's knowledge of the plantation's back country serving them well. He knew where the ground stayed firm, which creek beds would flood first, where fallen logs could serve as bridges across swollen streams. But even his woodsman's skills couldn't make the journey easy. "This way," he called over the howl of wind. "Higher ground." They climbed through a grove of pine trees, their feet slipping on wet needles and moss-covered stones. Eleanor's fine leather boots made for walking on polished floors, not wilderness paths, began to come apart at the seams. Lila, barefoot as always, moved with the sure-footed grace of someone raised outdoors. After an hour of hard travel, they stopped to rest under the shelter of a massive live oak. Eleanor slumped against the trunk, breathing hard. Her hair had escaped its pins and hung in wet tangles around her face. Mud stained her skirts up to the knee. "How much farther?" she gasped. Nathan studied the storm-dark sky. "Hard to say in this weather. Maybe 4 miles to the river crossing. Then another 3 to town. 7 miles. Eleanor tried not to think about her aching feet or the way her sodden dress chafed against her skin. "We can do 7 miles. Lila was already unpacking their meager supplies. The cornbread was still dry inside its cloth wrapping, and she divided it into 3 portions with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to waste food. "Nathan," she said as they ate, "tell me about the crossing again, the one from the hymn." Nathan's voice took on the rhythm of the old song. "Deep river, Lord. I want to cross over into campground, where the stone lies white beneath the water, where the sycamore marks the shallow way. Cross over into campground. White stone under the water," Lila repeated. "Sycamore tree. That's the ford at Miller's Bend," Nathan explained, "where the river runs wide and slow over limestone. Water's only knee-deep there, even when it's running high." Eleanor looked puzzled. "You've been there? Helped repair the miller's wheel 2 summers ago. Master Harrow hired me out for the work." Nathan's expression darkened, "though I never saw a penny of the wages." Another piece of the injustice that had shaped their lives. Eleanor was beginning to understand how many small cruelties added up to a system of bondage that went far beyond legal ownership. They finished their meal in relative quiet, listening to the storm rage through the trees. When the rain lessened slightly, they resumed their journey. The path grew rougher as they moved away from the plantation's managed lands. Here the forest was wilder, full of fallen trees and tangles of vine that caught at their clothes. Eleanor's dress, already torn and muddied, suffered further damage. By the time they reached the river, she looked more like a refugee than a plantation owner's daughter. The crossing at Miller's Bend was more dangerous than Nathan had expected. Storm runoff had swollen the river beyond its normal banks, and what should have been a gentle ford was now a rushing torrent of brown water and debris. There, Lila pointed to a white stone visible beneath the surface, just where the hymn had promised. But it's deeper than you said. Nathan waded in first, testing the current. The water reached his waist at the deepest point, manageable for him, but potentially deadly for Eleanor or Lila if they lost their footing. We'll go together, he decided. Eleanor, you hold my arm. Lila, you hold hers. We stay connected no matter what. The crossing was terrifying. The current pulled at their legs with surprising strength, and the smooth limestone bottom was slick as ice. Twice Eleanor slipped, saved only by Nathan's steady grip. A floating log swept past them, close enough that she could have reached out and touched it. But the white stone held firm beneath their feet, and the sycamore tree stood sentinel on the far bank, exactly as the hymn had promised. They reached the other side, gasping and soaked but safely across. How many people have followed that song to safety? Eleanor asked as they wrung water from their clothes. More than you might think, Nathan said. And probably more than Pike suspects. They were deep in contested territory now, the borderland between plantation country and the town where law meant something different than it did in the rice fields. Here, they might encounter patrols looking for runaway slaves, or they might find allies among the Quaker settlements that dotted the high country. As if reading her thoughts, Nathan pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from a grove of trees ahead. That's the Whitaker place. Elias Whitaker, he's good people. Eleanor recognized the name. Elias Whitaker was one of the area's Quaker farmers, a man who paid wages to his workers and sent his children to integrated schools. Her father had always spoken of the Quakers with a mixture of respect and irritation, good neighbors, but dangerous ideas. Will he help us? If he's there, yes. If not, Nathan's voice trailed off. They approached the farmhouse carefully. It was a modest structure built of fieldstone and timber, with a wide front porch and windows that glowed warm yellow in the storm-gray afternoon. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could see figures moving inside. Nathan knocked on the door with the special rhythm, 3 short, 2 long, that identified him as someone in need of sanctuary. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with kind eyes and work-calloused hands. Nathan, Elias Whitaker said, and young Lila, what brings thee out in such weather? We need help, Mr. Whitaker. Legal help. Elias's gaze moved to Eleanor, taking in her bedraggled appearance and obvious distress. His expression showed no surprise at seeing a white woman traveling with enslaved companions. The Underground Railroad had taught him to expect the unexpected. Come in, he said. All of thee. The farmhouse interior was simple but comfortable. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Elias's wife, Sarah, appeared from the kitchen with towels and dry clothes. Sit by the fire, she urged. Warm yourselves. There's stew, if thee are hungry. As they dried off and changed clothes, Nathan explained their situation. The manumission document, Pike's plan to sell him, the dangerous journey through the storm. Elias and Sarah listened without judgment, asking only occasional questions for clarification. When Nathan finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he went to a wooden cabinet and withdrew a leather portfolio similar to the one Lila had found in the big house. I may be able to help thee more than thee knows, he said. I have here the papers from Daniel Harrow's estate, including the original copy of his will. Eleanor looked up sharply. You have Uncle Daniel's will? I was one of his executors. Daniel and I, we disagreed on many things, but we respected each other. When he died, he asked me to ensure his final wishes were carried out properly. Elias opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. There was some confusion after his death about which papers should go to thy father and which should remain with the estate. I kept copies of everything for legal purposes. He found the will and spread it on the table. Eleanor recognized her uncle's handwriting, the same careful script that had penned the manumission document. "Here," Elias pointed to a specific passage. "Daniel left his books and papers to thy father, but with explicit instructions about this particular document." Eleanor read aloud. "The manumission agreement for Dinah and her children is to be honored according to its terms, with payment verified against the plantation ledgers. Should said payment be complete, freedom is to be granted immediately and recorded with the county clerk. Payment was complete 2 years ago," Lila said. "Uncle Daniel wrote it on the paper himself." Elias nodded. "Then Nathan and Lila should have been freed when Daniel died. The fact that they were not suggests either ignorance of the document's existence or willful disregard of its terms." Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks. Her father had to have seen the will, had to have known about Uncle Daniel's instructions, which meant he had chosen to ignore them, to keep Nathan and Lila enslaved despite their legal right to freedom. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We go to the courthouse," Elias said. "Present the evidence to Judge Langley. The manumission document, the will, the plantation ledgers if we can get them, and if Pike opposes us, then we let the law decide." Elias's voice was calm but firm. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when people try to bury it deep. Sarah appeared from the kitchen with steaming bowls of stew and thick slices of fresh bread. As they ate, Elias explained the legal process they would face. "Judge Langley is a fair man, but he follows the letter of the law. We'll need to prove 3 things: that the manumission document is authentic, that the conditions for freedom were met, and that the enslaved persons in question are indeed the children mentioned in the agreement. Can we prove all that?" "I believe so. I have Daniel's other writings for handwriting comparison. The will clearly states the conditions, and anyone who knows Nathan and Lila can testify to their identity as Dinah's children." Nathan set down his spoon. "Mr. Whitaker, what about afterward? If the judge rules in our favor, what then? Then thee are free, legally, completely free. But practically?" Elias was honest. "It will not be easy. There are those who would deny thy freedom regardless of what any judge says. There are places thee cannot go, work thee cannot do. But there are also communities that will welcome thee, employers who will pay fair wages. And Lila can attend school here, if thee wishes. Sarah teaches the children in our settlement. She would welcome another bright student." Eleanor looked at Lila's face as the possibilities sank in. The child's eyes were wide with wonder at the thought of real school, proper books, teachers who would nurture her extraordinary memory. "When can we go to the courthouse?" Eleanor asked. "First light tomorrow, if the storm passes. Judge Langley holds court on Fridays." Eleanor realized suddenly that she had no idea what day it was. Time had become fluid since Nathan's injury, measured not by clocks and calendars, but by the rhythm of healing and the urgency of escape. "Today is Thursday," Elias said, reading her confusion. "Thee have arrived at precisely the right time. Another small miracle in a day full of them." That evening, as the storm finally began to weaken, they sat around the Whitakers' hearth and planned for the morning. Eleanor borrowed paper and pen to write a letter to her father, explaining her actions and her hopes for the future. It was a difficult letter to compose. How did you tell your father that his brother's dying wishes took precedence over the family's financial needs? "Nathan worked on a small wooden figure, a gift for Henry," he explained, in case he never got another chance to make the boy a toy. His hands moved with the careful precision that had marked all his carpentry, even under the most difficult circumstances. And Lila practiced reciting the manumission document from memory, her perfect recall ensuring that every word would be preserved even if the paper itself were somehow lost or damaged. "Bill of manumission for Dinah, enslaved woman of the Harrow plantation, and her issue," she began, her young voice clear and steady. As she spoke, Eleanor realized that this child, barely old enough to read, raised without formal education, had become the keeper of their hopes. Lila's memory was their insurance against disaster, their guarantee that the truth would survive no matter what tomorrow brought. Outside, rain still fell, but with less violence. The storm was moving on, leaving behind cleaner air and the promise of clearing skies. In a few hours, they would make their way to town and face whatever judgment awaited them. But for now, in the warm sanctuary of the Whitaker home, they were safe. Eleanor curled up on a pallet near the fire, listening to the quiet conversations around her and feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The deep, bone-tired peace that came from doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, 3 unlikely companions rested in the knowledge that they had chosen courage over convenience, truth over comfort. And somewhere in the distance, like a hymn carried on the wind, Eleanor could almost hear the sound of freedom calling. Dawn came clear and cool, with the kind of crystalline light that follows a storm. Eleanor woke to the smell of corn cakes and coffee, and the sound of Lila's voice drifting from the kitchen where she helped Sarah with breakfast preparations. Libertas concessa, Lila was saying, practicing the Latin phrases. Testamentum confirmatum, freedom granted, will confirmed. Eleanor smiled despite her nervousness. The child's determination to get every word perfect was remarkable. But then, everything about Lila was remarkable, her memory, her courage, her quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken many adults. Nathan was already dressed and standing by the window, watching the road that led to town. His movements were careful but sure, the deep wounds across his back having healed enough to allow normal activity. Soon, too soon, Pike would notice his recovery and begin arrangements for the sale. Time to go, Elias announced from the doorway. The roads will be muddy, but passable. They gathered their few possessions and the precious documents that represented their hope for justice. Eleanor had borrowed a plain brown dress from Sarah, much more practical than her ruined finery. Nathan carried the manumission papers wrapped in oiled cloth. Lila wore a simple blue cotton dress that had belonged to one of the Whitaker daughters, her bare feet clean and her hair neatly braided. The wagon ride to town took nearly 2 hours. The storm had left the roads rutted and treacherous, and they had to stop several times to clear fallen branches from their path. But the countryside was beautiful in the clean morning air, with water still dripping from the trees and birdsong replacing the howl of wind. As they approached the outskirts of town, Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, would be decided in the next few hours. "Remember," Elias said as the courthouse came into view, "tell the truth simply." Judge Langley appreciates honesty above eloquence. The courthouse was a modest brick building with white columns and tall windows that let in the morning light. A small crowd had already gathered on the front steps, lawyers, merchants, farmers, with legal business. Eleanor recognized several faces from her father's social circle and wondered what they would think when they learned why she was there. They were halfway up the courthouse steps when Pike appeared. He must have ridden hard through the storm to reach town before them. His clothes were mud-splattered and his face dark with anger. Behind him came 2 hired men, the kind of rough characters who made their living catching runaway slaves. "That's far enough," Pike called out. Nathan stopped, his hand moving protectively to Lila's shoulder. Eleanor stepped closer to both of them, her chin raised in defiance. "We have legal business here, Mr. Pike," she said. "You have stolen property there," Pike replied. "That boy belongs to your father, and I'm taking him back." "Nathan isn't property," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. "He's a free man." Pike laughed. "Free? Girl, you've been listening to too many abolitionist speeches. That boy was born a slave and he'll die a slave. Not according to this." Eleanor held up the manumission document. Pike's eyes went wide as he recognized Daniel Harrow's careful handwriting. "Where did you get that?" "It was in Uncle Daniel's papers, right where it belonged. The papers my father inherited when Uncle Daniel died." Pike's face went pale. Eleanor realized that he had known about the document all along, had probably hidden it to protect his own plans for Nathan's sale. "That paper don't mean nothing," Pike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Old scribbling from a dead man." "It means everything," said a new voice from behind them. Judge Langley stood in the courthouse doorway, an elderly man with silver hair and sharp eyes. He had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. "I believe I'll examine this document myself," the judge said. "Mr. Pike, you and your men will wait here while I convene an emergency hearing." Pike started to object, but the judge's stern look silenced him. "Court will be in session in 10 minutes, Judge Langley announced. "All interested parties may attend." The courtroom was small but dignified, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that cast long rectangles of sunlight across the floor. Eleanor, Nathan, and Lila sat at one table with Elias as their representative. Pike sat at another with a hired lawyer who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Judge Langley examined the manumission document carefully, comparing the handwriting with other samples of Daniel Harrow's writing that Elias provided. He read the will, studied the plantation ledgers, and questioned each witness in turn. When it was Lila's turn to speak, she stood straight and tall despite her small size. "State your name for the record," the judge said gently. "Lila, daughter of Dinah, sister to Nathan. And can you read the document in question?" "Yes, sir. It says, Bill of Manumission for Dinah, enslaved woman of the Harrow plantation, and her issue, contingent upon payment of land debt in the amount of $800, said payment to be credited against her labor over a period not to exceed 7 years from this date. Upon fulfillment of said terms, Dinah and her children shall be considered free persons under the laws of South Carolina." The courtroom was silent as Lila recited the entire document from memory, word for word, without a single error. "And the notation at the bottom?" the judge asked. "Debt paid in full, April 1851, D.H. That's Uncle Daniel's mark, sir." "Same as on the will." Pike's lawyer tried to object. "Your Honor, the child could have been coached." "Could she have been coached to read Latin as well?" the judge interrupted. He handed Lila a law book, open to a random page. "Read this passage, child." Lila looked at the page for a moment, then began, "Habeas corpus ad subjiciendum est remedium extraordinarium." She continued for several sentences, then looked up. "It's about a legal remedy for unlawful imprisonment, sir." Judge Langley raised his eyebrows. "Where did you learn Latin?" "From church, sir, and from studying the margins in Master's Bible." The judge turned to Pike. "Mr. Pike, do you have any evidence that this manumission document is fraudulent?" Pike shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, that is to say, do you have any evidence that the debt mentioned in the document was not paid in full?" The plantation ledgers show exactly what Mr. Whitaker presented to this court," the judge interrupted. "A debt incurred for land purchase, paid off through Dinah's labor over 6 years. The payment was completed in April 1851, exactly as notated." Pike's face grew red. "Your Honor, even if that paper is real, you can't just let them walk away. Mr. Harrow's got debts to pay, creditors pressing him." "Mr. Pike," the judge's voice was stern, "the financial difficulties of the Harrow plantation do not supersede the legal rights granted by a properly executed manumission document." Eleanor felt her heart racing. Was it really going to be this straightforward? Could years of bondage be ended with a few documents and a child's perfect memory? But Pike wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I got a bill of sale right here," he said, producing a paper from his coat, "signed by Mr. Harrow himself just yesterday. Nathan, here, was sold to me legal and proper." Eleanor gasped. Her father had signed papers selling Nathan to Pike? When? Why? Judge Langley examined the new document. His expression grew troubled. "This appears to be a legitimate bill of sale," he said slowly. "Signed and witnessed." "Papa wouldn't," Eleanor began, then stopped. Her father was desperate, drowning in debt, and she had disappeared in the middle of the storm, taking Nathan with her. He might well have assumed the worst. But Lila was studying the bill of sale with intense concentration. Suddenly, her face lit up. "Your Honor," she said, "may I see that paper?" The judge handed her the document. Lila examined it closely, then looked up with excitement. "This signature isn't right," she said. "What do you mean, child?" "Master Harrow's signature, his S curls to the left, and his H has a little flourish at the bottom. This S is straight, and the H is plain. It's not his hand." Pike jumped up. "You calling me a forger?" "I'm saying this isn't Master Harrow's true signature," Lila replied calmly. "I've seen him sign papers many times. This isn't how he writes." Judge Langley called for a recess and sent for samples of Mr. Harrow's genuine signature from the county records. When the papers arrived an hour later, the difference was clear. Pike's bill of sale was a forgery, and not a very good one. "Mr. Pike," the judge said when court reconvened, "you are charged with forgery and attempted slave theft. Bailiff, place him under arrest." Pike struggled as he was led away, his hired men slipping out of the courtroom to avoid their own legal troubles. "Now then," Judge Langley continued, "having examined all the evidence, I find the manumission document to be authentic and legally binding. Nathan and Lila, children of Dinah, are hereby declared free persons under the laws of South Carolina." The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered, others grumbled about the precedent being set. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Nathan and Lila embrace, their joy tempered by the weight of all they had endured to reach this moment. But the judge wasn't finished. "There is, however, the matter of public record," he said. "This court requires that all parties involved appear on the courthouse steps for the formal declaration of freedom." Eleanor's stomach tightened. A public declaration would make their actions known to everyone in town. There would be consequences, social, economic, perhaps even physical. But she had come too far to turn back now. On the courthouse steps, with the entire town watching, Judge Langley read the manumission document aloud. His voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. "Let it be known that Nathan and Lila, children of Dinah, are free persons, no longer bound by the institution of slavery, with all the rights and privileges accorded to free citizens of this state." Eleanor stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I want to say something," she announced. The crowd quieted, waiting. "2 weeks ago, I stood on my father's gallery and said that slaves are dirty. I said it loudly, in front of witnesses, because I believed it was true." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor forced herself to continue. "I was wrong. The dirty thing was not Nathan's skin or Lila's bare feet. The dirty thing was the hatred in my own heart." She reached into her bag and withdrew a basin and a pitcher of clean water items she had borrowed from the Whitakers that morning. "Nathan," she said, "would you permit me to wash your hands?" He looked at her with wonder and something deeper, love, forgiveness, hope for a future they might build together despite all the obstacles that lay ahead. "Yes," he said simply. Eleanor knelt on the courthouse steps and poured water over Nathan's scarred hands. The water ran clear, catching the sunlight like liquid diamonds. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she gently scrubbed away the dust of their journey and dried his hands with a clean white cloth. When she finished, she stood and faced the crowd. "I was raised to believe that some people were worth more than others," she said. "I was taught that the color of a person's skin determined their value, but Nathan saved my life, and in healing his wounds, I discovered that love doesn't know the difference between slave and free. It only knows the difference between kindness and cruelty, between justice and oppression." She turned to Nathan and Lila. "If you'll have me," she said, "I would like to be part of whatever life you build in freedom." Nathan stepped forward and took her hands in his clean ones. "Eleanor Harrow," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square, "you have already given us more than freedom. You have given us hope." One man in the crowd, a weathered farmer Eleanor didn't recognize, removed his hat and held it against his chest. "I seen. Enough," he said loudly. "I got no more stomach for chasing runaways or returning free people to bondage." Others in the crowd began to murmur agreement. Not all, there were still hard faces and angry voices, but enough to suggest that change was possible, that hearts could be moved by witnessing courage and compassion. As the formal proceedings concluded, Eleanor found herself signing papers she had never imagined, documents transferring some of her father's land to Elias Whitaker's Quaker settlement, agreements establishing wages for workers who had previously labored without pay. Her father's ring, the one meant for an arranged marriage to secure the family's finances, she slipped onto Lila's finger instead. "For your education," she said, "and your future." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for the child's small hand. That evening, as shadows grew long across the courthouse square, they gathered for one last meal at the Whitaker farm before beginning their new lives. Preacher Reed had arrived from the plantation with news that Mr. Harrow, weakened by fever and shock at his daughter's disappearance, had agreed to the new arrangements. "The old way is dying," the preacher said as they sat around the simple wooden table. "Your father sees that now. The question is what will replace it." Eleanor looked around the table at Nathan, his face peaceful for the first time since she'd known him. At Lila, already absorbed in a primer Sarah had given her. At Elias and Sarah, whose quiet faith had helped make this day possible. Something better, she said. Something built on the idea that every person has worth. As night fell, they made their way to the porch where Elias led them in an evening hymn. Voices rose together, white and black, formerly enslaved and formerly free, singing the old song about crossing Jordan that had guided them through the storm. But now the words carried a different meaning. The river had been crossed. The promised land was not some distant shore, but right here, in this moment, among people who had chosen love over law, justice over comfort. Lila's voice soared above the others, her perfect pitch carrying the melody toward the darkening sky. Eleanor listened and thought of all the songs that child would sing in the years to come, in school, in church, in whatever life her extraordinary gifts would build. Nathan reached over and took Eleanor's hand. His palm was warm and calloused from honest work, marked by scars that told the story of his courage. Soon, when the law allowed it, those hands would wear a wedding ring. But for now, it was enough to sit together on the porch and listen to the music of a world being reborn. Inside the house, Sarah lit a lantern and placed it in the front window, a signal to any traveler that this was a safe place, a home where refugees could find sanctuary and hope. The light flickered once, then settled into a steady glow that would burn through the night and into the morning, marking the beginning of a new day. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying goods and passengers toward futures that had seemed impossible just days before. The sound was full of possibility, full of the promise that freedom, once tasted, would spread like light across a darkening land. Eleanor smiled and squeezed Nathan's hand, feeling the weight of all they had risked and the joy of all they had gained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles for the kind of justice they had glimpsed today. But tonight, on a porch where all voices could sing together, hope felt as real as the warm light spilling from the window into the gathering dark.